My more recent videos have been a bit more negative regarding certain gacha game communities, so counterpoint to that would be this video, which will serve to exemplify the best aspects of different communities and which one overall may have the best experience. Keep in mind, everything I say in this video would just be my opinion, and I understand that you can have an entirely different perspective and you could have an entirely different interaction with a community. For instance, if I say Genshin Impact has the worst community, you could have an amazing time there, and the opposite can happen as well. Ultimately, it's down to your individual preferences, what you prefer, how you interact and how you choose, and where you go, because you do have different parts of communities that are both good and bad here and there, and ultimately I can guarantee that one side will welcome you as opposed to the other. So with all that being said, we're going to start off with the Genshin Impact, mostly because it's the largest one and it's most consistent across these 3 videos that I've done. With that being said, Genshin Impact has the most wide audience, the largest one out of all of them, and its mainstream appeal kind of works to its disadvantage sometimes. A lot of the issues you hear about or see with Genshin Impact either occur because it's such a large community or because a lot of the individuals who have played that game aren't exactly as used to gacha games, or perhaps Genshin is their first gacha game. As such, it's a bit difficult to get a gauge on the overall community status because you have some who are veterans of the gacha genre, you have others who have played Shanghai, developed by the same company, and you have some who are just a first-time gacha player. Regardless, Genshin Impact's community is because of its vastness, because of how large it is arguably one of the more helpful ones because you have players starting at different times. You know, the user ID displays how long essentially you've been playing or how old the account you're on is, and ultimately you're going to see a lot more new players who have a wide variety of resources. You have guides, you have individuals online who will help you if you ask in the subreddit. In the Genshin Impact subreddit, for example, there's the daily questions in which a bunch of people will kind of answer your questions in the event that you're concerned or are confused. Now, don't get me wrong, the vastness doesn't necessarily take away from anything either. You have the helpful vast majority and you have the wide variety of resources, but that also means that the more toxic aspect of the game and the more toxic side of the game is much larger by comparison. If you were to compare Genshin Impact's community size to something like Blue Archive, it's a very large difference, and that's possibly why a lot of individuals in the Blue Archive community don't feel like they've met very many toxic individuals, if any at all, because the community is much smaller. I had asked individuals in my Discord server, join if you haven't already, what their opinion is on the best community and on the worst communities. And I do think it's important to say and important to clarify, when you're talking about really good communities, one of the common points is the shared mindset, whether that be the game is meta and extremely difficult, a lot of individuals are just trying to look for the best way to optimize their accounts and pass, or whether it be there's a bunch of cute characters, you want them, and therefore you get them. Azure Lane, for example, was named just simply because the community is very lewd and there's a vast majority of characters. This means the vast majority of players who talk about the game, who are going to be interacting with other players in that fan base, essentially have the similar mindset. They see a cute character, they want that, thereby meaning it's much easier for the community to bond and agree over certain topics because of that. Sure, there is a meta in the game, but ultimately it doesn't necessarily impact everyone's experience as much as other games, thereby meaning that because of the nature of the game, because of how characters are marketed, because of how skins are marketed, it ends up meaning that a lot of the community members just want the character. They go for a waifu over meta position as opposed to meta even playing a factor half the time. Now, once again, this is just based on the opinion of a few individuals. If you have a different perspective, hey, tell me down below. Next up, I would say it's Blue Archive. Now, Blue Archive, let's be honest here, does have a very visually focused appeal. And despite the essentially negative connotation attached to the Blue Archive community, because there is a negative connotation given the setting and given the ages of the characters, the community itself is very chill and calm. Even my own community in the Discord server and in other servers as well, if you go there, people are generally pretty welcoming. Even if I'm looking at my own analytics, my worst like-dislike ratio is with the Genshin videos, followed by the Arknights videos, but the best ones always have Blue Archive videos. They're always like 98% likes. So even just the community reception and response to different types of content is always the best. So from my perspective, yeah, the Blue Archive community is really good, but we're also the smallest community out of these ones mentioned. It was smaller than the Genshin, Shanghai, Arknights, Azure Lane community just because of how new the game is. I even discussed Blue Archive and Genshin Impact with my coworkers, and one of the main things they brought up, or one of the main connotations they attach usually, is the age of the characters to Blue Archive. And with Genshin Impact, for some reason people attach Klee and Diona to that game as opposed to literally anything else. But regardless, Genshin's large scale and Blue Archive's much smaller scale, especially by comparison, do mean that the communities are going to be vastly different, especially considering that if you're talking about a negative minority having and being very vocal in Genshin Impact, they, in that same vein, with that same percentage, would be much smaller in the Blue Archive community just because of that. This doesn't mean that the Blue Archive has no toxic side or is a perfect community. It just means that it's so much smaller that it's arguably more difficult to find that. Arknights is a much more established game. Originally when it came out, I didn't play it, so I can't speak on how it was when it first dropped, but I have heard that the community was vaguely similar to Genshin. It was such a popular game that you arguably had a lot of newer individuals to the gacha scene playing it, and therefore meaning that the community was a bit more angry and toxic than it is now. As of now, given the age of the game, it's chilled out, it's mellowed out, and the community has settled. Now, I'm putting it on par with the Blue Archive community just because, in my opinion, they're both really great. They're both really chill communities. I don't know how Blue Archive's going to get when it grows larger, or how Arknights is going to get when Enfield drops. But to that same extent, Arknights is given that it's much more established, the community kind of chilled out, it's mellowed out, people are really understanding of newer players. And people kind of are open with their attraction to certain units. That's perfectly fine. I do believe the Arknights community is a much better example. In my opinion, I want the Arknights community to essentially be what the Genshin community turns into. A much more chill and calmed experience, maybe after a year or two. I've been to Arknights Discord servers, and they are really nice there. And ultimately, I find the Arknights community to be an amazing one to interact with. So if I were to recommend anyone to play a game, it would be Azur Lane, Blue Archive, and Arknights first. And even though Genshin's the most approachable, even though Genshin has the most content, I'd say you can stick with the Genshin community, just never go to Twitter. There are certain places in communities in which I absolutely cannot recommend. Genshin Twitter is the worst one, and I absolutely would not recommend anybody really go there unless you're willing to try and bob and weave and dodge a lot of the issues. Whereas most other games don't really have a Twitter. I mean, hey, if you go to the Blue Archive Twitter and you find posts, you're going to find a lot of comments that are very questionable. And Arknights is usually trending as well. All games have really active ARC communities, and I think those ARC communities play a big role in each of the game's success. So ultimately, to clarify, I don't think any gacha game community is purely bad. I do think it's much more easy to find negative and bad aspects of a gacha game. I do think it's much easier to find and point out a bad and toxic side of a community. For instance, it's always easy to attribute most of the Genshin fanbase to that toxic side and thereby justify not interacting or not playing the game. In the same way that you could say it's very approachable to play the game and ignore the community entirely. And you could have an entirely different response and different opinion. You could ultimately play the entire game, interact with communities, and have nothing but positive experiences. However, somebody else could do that same thing and have nothing but negative experiences. It's really just a case-by-case basis. So I'm in no way trying to stop you from playing the game. Instead, my main point here is just to discuss and talk about good and bad communities and why they kind of are. I think a lot of them just boil down to, hey, look, people are horny. And the communities that embrace that usually are the best ones because everyone's on the same page. So ultimately, tell me down below, what games do you play that I haven't discussed? Is it Shanghai Impact? Is it Counterside, Art of Year Fusion? Are you talking about Tower of Fantasies? Growing community. Maybe you play Epic 7 and have a different opinion on that community. Overall, I only wanted to discuss the games that I've actively played, and this is where I'm coming from here. If you enjoyed, join the Discord server, leave a like down below, and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.